Hello and welcome to Tremaine Sci-Fi Hour. Today we are discussing Robert Heinlein, the the famous science fiction writer, and apparently someone who worked on the space. What were you saying, Jake? The space defense program.
Strategic Defense Initiative?
Yeah, so apparently he did that as well. So Jag, we're gonna do a biography similar to how we did Doc Smith an episode or two ago. So, Jag, start us off. Where did Heinlein, where does he begin life?
So, he was born in the little town of Butler, Missouri. Missouri or
Missouri.
doesn't really matter.
Yeah, we did spend like 10 or so minutes trying to figure out how to pronounce the state and just realized no one really knows. Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to the three main pronunciations and went, Missouri. Okay. So Butler is currently population 4,000. Yes, this the 4,000 people. It's a tiny little place. It is the county seat of Bates County. So as far as Bates County goes, it's big. We gotta remember, oh man, there are some places in America where it's like, this seems like it should be a big place, and then it's not.
Thank you for that in-depth insight.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not. Okay.
I would say Bates County and Butler are very much European American.
Right.
So Heinlein himself, specifically Robert Anson Heinlein, because his whole family were Heinleins, he is a sixth generation German American.
And now we did briefly touch on this, how strange. I mean, it's strange to me, I think. I don't know if it's strange to you.
I'm a second generation Kiwi, and I just call myself a New Zealander.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking about like how. Okay, so would you call someone, because Heinlein's family, correct me if I'm wrong, was fought in the War of Independence for America.
Yep, on the side of America, and every war after that.
So you have wait. Does that mean which side was he on in the Civil War?
Ooh,
we may have just hit something.
I'm really sure they were on the northern side.
Oh, okay. Sure. Anyway, we were talking about how he was considered German American, and we're like, well, he's been there since like
2 generations,
like 6 generation American.
Is that a self-identification
thing? True. That could be. You know how like some Americans are like, oh, I'm Irish, even though they've been in America for 6 or 7 generations, and they still consider themselves Irish.
Well, they consider themselves Irish one day in the year. St. Patrick's Day.
Well, no, because
they don't consider themselves Irish.
Because Conan, Conan O'Brien, the talk show host.
Well, at least he has an Irish name.
And also, he is 100% Irish, as we found out on the Stephen Colbert show. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked by the fact that Conan O'Brien's inbred. So, Heinlein. So, we've talked about how he was German American, his family had a military tradition, and we're also going to talk about how he was Republican despite being one of the biggest liberals.
I thought Conan O'Brien was Jewish. He speaks Hebrew.
Does he?
Not fluently, but he can, conversationally. Oh, well,
Where did you get that piece of information from? Jesus!
He was at the Tel Aviv airport, and was speaking Hebrew to people.
Oh.
It was a really important thing at the time. Anyway, so Heinlein, 6th generation German American, very American.
Yeah, he said
Oh, I
yippee-ki-yay,
mean,
motherfucker,
yeah,
a lot.
exactly. Seems sort of a cowboy sort of area. No, so what's interesting is he cites the 1910 appearance of Halley's Comet as setting him on this lifelong interest in astronomy,
Right.
which would be weird because he'd be 3 at the time, and I don't see how that could do that. You don't have memories
Right.
of being 3. I mean, maybe the lingering effect of it, like, so that got him interested in space and stars and stuff.
Well, yeah, because
And then
what
when he was older, he was still interested.
it could have hit like a domino effect where he's like, "Oh my god, that's awesome" as a kid, and then he starts like star watching or whatever,
Mm.
which then falls on to him becoming older. And I guess then he must have asked his parents what started me on this, and then they must have gone, "Ah, you saw Haley's comment as a 3-year-old," or maybe
Yeah.
he just made it up to make it sound cool. I don't know.
So, being one of 7 children,
Oof,
his family could not send him to college. It was expensive.
yeah,
Even though his father was an accountant, we are now looking at the early 20s
he
here.
hadn't accounted for that many kids. I'm sorry. I'll see
Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba.
myself out. Welcome to Jag's Sci-Fi Out. No.
I'm gonna yell at you about Heinlein. Uh, so they did what you did at the time, even now, actually, in a way. Send him to the military. So,
Yeah.
well, specifically with their prestigious military background, it was going for an appointment to the United States Naval Academy. Bit better than just being a grunt. However, his older brother was there, and the rules at the time were no, can't have multiple people from the same family at the same time. So
And we have
you're out.
discussed this. Now, if you're thinking, why, if you were like me and you think, well, yeah, that's to make sure that you don't send too many kids to the same academy. Wait, actually, yeah, that's something I wanted to know. Were they required to accept people? Like, as long as they fitted the criteria?
No,
Oh, okay, no.
no,
Then it makes absolutely no sense why you can't have multiple. Yeah, no, that's stupid. Carry
because
on.
you don't only have to apply, but you also need to receive a nomination, and the nominations usually have to be from a member of Congress. Like, it's hard to get in. You got to know people, basically. It's it's crazy. um, and it was to make officers for the next war, basically. Um, when you graduated, you were a naval officer, so it wasn't just for anyone. It was for the upper crust of
The creme de
military
la
life.
creme.
You were actually commissioned as opposed to being an NCO. Um, I can't actually find a citation for they didn't allow multiple family members at the same time. This may be apocryphal, the reasoning. Either way, for whatever reason he didn't get in, he went to Kansas City Community College because, again, couldn't really afford, yeah, college, and got
Right.
his local senator, James A. Reed, to send the letters of nomination that were required. He hassled James A. Reed so much that in the year 1924 to 1925 that he was in community college, the senator sent a total of 100 letters of recommendation, 50 of them for other people, and 50 of them were just for Heinlein. So they received basically one letter of recommendation a week. Like, hey, take Heinlein, take Heinlein, take Heinlein. He'd really
Please.
love to be an officer.
Get him out of my fucking office. He won't leave me alone.
So what that says to me is that Heinlein was hassling Reed more than once a week.
It's great, yeah.
Also, the fact is that he was at Kansas City Community College and petitioning the Missouri senator. So
did he spend more in postage than he? Did he spend more in postage like Doc Smith?
Exactly. Like, is that just a lot of telegrams?
Telegram, sir, from Heinlein. Telegram, sir, from Heinlein. Oh, fuck.
Yes, I know. Well, legally, we have to make sure these are delivered.
Can you just tell him to stop? You want him to stop? Stop?
Telegrams are still used today for important things because it is a registered form of communication. When the person delivers a telegram, they can certify the person received it. So it's used for very important communications to this day in America.
Of course.
Same reason fax is so important. You can actually pull the phone records and see that the fax was sent and received. A letter, you can just burn that.
Can you not burn a telegram?
You can, but whoever sent it can prove you got it.
Oh, I see.
A letter, I never saw it.
But what about an email? Surely you could certify when that was received.
You can't certify that the correct person received it. Also, you can fake that.
As interesting as this conversation is, Jag, I think we should get back to Heinlein. Man, we're getting sidetracked today.
Fantastic. So, he did go to the Naval Academy.
Right.
He graduated with the equivalent of a Bachelor of Arts in Engineering. At the time, the Academy did not give degrees.
Oh.
But his equivalent would have allowed him to get a job that required one, essentially.
Right.
He was very intelligent, very clever. Academically, he was 5th in his class.
I mean, it's not bad. How many people were in the class?
243.
Yeah, okay, that's not bad.
Of which he was ranked 20th.
Again, not bad.
He would have been 5th, but he received too many disciplinary demerits. He was a naughty boy and got dropped down to 20th.
He was a naughty boy. Yeah.
Which, going with some of the things we'll mention later, yeah.
Yeah, also, trigger warning for that. There may be some mentions of some weird sexual things and...
That reminds me, in our previous episode, I mentioned that he may be somewhat of a pervert. Now, that is widely disputed. It's generally accepted that he wasn't actually a pervert. We'll get to that, but basically, he was using it as a way to explore questions.
Concepts, yeah.
Yeah, is this actually bad?
So,
if it is, you should be able to think about it.
I do want to
come to the conclusion it's bad.
Yeah, I do want to comment on that slightly. So, Jag and I don't know if there's a word to describe it. We often explore concepts that you would consider reprehensible in private, not in public. But we often do that because we want to understand why it's wrong. And so, for a lot of people, if they were, so an example of that may be, here we are. Should we punish or rehabilitate pedophiles? That's an example. We talked about this because we were like, okay, pedophilia is obviously a horrible crime and evil, but do we try to make it so people are willing to come forward as pedophiles so we can prevent further crime? Or do we continue punishing them, making sure that people do it underground a bit harder? And that's something. So that's an example. So even though most people would be like, okay, pedophilia reprehensible, just punish them. Some people like us like to explore these ideas a bit more in depth. So oftentimes we are more left wing or more, what would you call it? We're usually quite radical in our thinking, but we tend to explore these ideas because we're not sort of bound by that. Anyway, Jag, carry on.
We're liberal in the liberal arts sense of liberal. The important thing there is, if something is true, it can withstand any sort of critique.
Yeah.
I suppose the most important part of me bringing this up, though, is Heinlein did pass away in 1988, and legally speaking, you cannot slander the dead. So anything I've said that's not true about him, that's a shame.
Does that mean we're going to delay our George Lucas video?
If you've said anything that might be slander or defamation, wait till he's dead, and then you can say what you like.
Hitler was a pussy. There we go.
You can say anything about him. True, untrue, malicious, doesn't matter, he did.
He did.
Now, I do have some respect for Heinlein, so I did want to clear up that he probably wasn't a massive pervert. Just exploring concepts to see if our societal expectations and rules do make sense. The conclusion usually being yes. Now, to be honest, his time in the military was not that exciting.
Okay. What wars were going on at the time?
Well, none.
Yeah, that wouldn't be that exciting.
He was born 1907, so...
Okay, so you would have been too young for World War One, and probably too old for World War Two?
No.
Oh.
But he entered the academy in 1925.
Okay, yeah.
I believe it's usually about 4 years. Oh,
yeah. So 1929 during the Great. So he would have graduated the year of the Great Depression. He would have then. Well, how long did he serve in the Navy for?
So there is a photo of him from his 1929 yearbook,
and he does look dapper.
Oh, doesn't he? He is dashing. But he did then go into the Navy itself. He worked on radio communications and lieutenant junior grade. He became a actual lieutenant. As a gunnery officer, 1933, 1934. But it was at 1934 that he was kicked out of the Navy because he got sick.
Sorry, what?
Well, he got TB.
Yeah. Is TB... I actually don't know much about TB. Is it infectious?
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense then, at least. That.
It is in your saliva. And
was it an honourable discharge or a dishonourable?
It just says discharge, but I'm pretty sure at the time TB was considered, like, fair. Like, you know, it's not dishonourable.
Right, okay, yeah.
It would have been just a straight discharge. Like, you can't work here anymore. Bye.
Bye.
It is... TB is quite bad, to be clear. I believe it was because of TB that Singapore made it illegal to spit. Like, on the ground.
Oh, yes, I do. Because when I went to Singapore, I remember seeing that and I was like...
Chewing gum is illegal.
Yeah, I know. I was like, why can't I buy any chewing gum? And they're like, it's against
TB.
the law. And I'm like, it's against the law to buy chewing gum. And to be honest, none of them could actually really explain why. So I guess they just sort of lost why they just sort of carry on. It's like, yeah, no. But it must be said, it has made a very clean country.
Yeah, so it had about a 5% fatality rate, so people did care.
Oh, yeah, okay, that would have been...
Can you imagine people caring that much about a disease caused by spitting, coughing, sneezing? Anyway. It was during his time in the Navy that he met and married his first wife.
Yeah.
I should probably wait a bit, let you recover.
If you're wondering what disease Jag is talking, no. Okay, so he met his first wife after he was discharged from the Navy.
No, sorry, during his time in the Navy.
Oh, sorry, I was laughing. I
Eleanor
couldn't hear you.
Hurry.
Ooh.
They were married for a whole year.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, given it was 1929, it is kind of odd to get a divorce.
Yes.
There really isn't much said about why they broke up.
Well, I saw briefly about the second wife, but I didn't see anything about the first wife.
There's a lot of information about the second wife.
Yeah.
So his second wife was Leslyn MacDonald, and they were together for 15 years. She was incredibly smart, and well, I mean, I suppose that's mainly it. Like, she was a big influence on him as to how a woman can be. Unfortunately, she did become a terrible alcoholic. To the point that Heinlein moved out, Heinlein left, and then they just did a mutual divorce, apparently.
Well, I suppose that comes with the territory, doesn't it, Jake? In those days, there's no excuse for alcoholism, but that sort of seemed to be the thing of those days. Is when you were
we knew less.
Alcohol's a
Do
lot
we
of
know better?
fun.
Yes. It's still a problem now, so like we can't really be mean about it. But after their divorce, he got married to Virginia Gerstenfeld.
Okay.
Now this is the one that had the most influence on the content of his writing.
Right.
If you're familiar with Heinlein's work, he writes incredibly strong but also incredibly feminine characters.
Right. Yeah.
His women are undoubtedly women, but they're women who don't need no man. And frequently they're women who kill men. Because that's what strong is. His wife, Ginny, was a chemist and a rocket test engineer. She was also in the Navy, where she held a higher rank than him, and was an accomplished college athlete.
Right.
So it's quite easy to be influenced by a strong woman when your wife is a much stronger person. Smarter, more athletic. To be fair, she didn't get TB.
Yeah.
TB is also referred to as consumption because it causes terrible weight loss and withering of the body. So, like, yeah.
Oh, that actually. Okay. You've just
It's called
explained.
consumption because it consumes you.
Okay, so. Okay, there's. I don't know if anyone knows Don Rickles, but there's a scene where there's like a thing he has on Johnny Carson's show where he just starts coughing horrendously. He's like, I got a touch of the consumption. I assumed it was something to do with alcoholism. I was just like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The Doc Holliday disease or whatever it was. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. And also influenced his work in a different way.
Right.
She hated flying.
Okay.
Absolutely hated flying. But loved travel. So they did round the world trips on ocean liners, cargo liners, lots of boats. Now, if you look at a lot of his travel work, Podkayne of Mars, for example,
Yeah.
he describes spaceships like boats.
So sort of like how Star Wars has boats, sort of boat
Yeah,
ships.
yeah. So Star Wars is focused heavily on military boats, dreadnoughts, battleships, that sort of thing.
Destroyers,
He
yeah.
viewed a lot of spaceships as ocean liners.
Right, okay, yeah. So like big vessels that carry lots of things rather than small plane-like vessels that just sort of travel passengers.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of other authors do view spaceships more as planes.
Right, yeah.
He viewed them as boats. And then in one of my favorites, probably because I have the physical copy and that means I read it a lot. Job, A Comedy of Justice. Um, it a lot of it takes place on board an ocean cruise. So, and he wouldn't have. Oh, I assume he wouldn't have written so much, ocean cruise work if they hadn't been on so much ocean cruises.
So did you get that book as part of your, like, you said this in the Doc Smith episode that you got a bunch of books from.
Essentially, as an inheritance, yes.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on that slightly because, I inherited a lot of non-fiction books.
Hmm.
So that's influenced me in that way. So for my teenage years, I was reading history, philosophy, psychology, and things like that. How do you think? Do you have? Is that where your fondness of reading comes from? When you had like these books that just had things that were beyond what you could think of as a young child? Is that sort of where your
So
fondness of
I
reading?
I was already a reader at that point.
Right,
So at that stage, we're looking at sometime maybe between 10 and 12.
right.
I was already quite thoroughly a reader. Um, and again, mainly fiction. I liked I like classic religion stuff. The Greeks, the Norse,
Romans,
Romans, all the I liked old fiction basically from.
a very young age. And because I mean, we've seen this as an influence on you because I mean, all the authors you talk about have been dead for nearly 30 years. I mean, what? Asimov, Heinlein, Smith, Clark. They've all been dead. Barely any of them saw the 2000s. So I guess it's sort of interesting
Oh,
for
Scott Card, Charles Stross.
whenever you mention
They're
them,
alive.
are they?
Yeah.
In my heart, they are Gandhi. Gandhi. I mean
I
Tremaine.
mean, Orson Scott Card is old and weird, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah,
More
but
than Sci-Fi is strange, man.
but yeah, it's interesting because for me, my fondness comes back to when it was like, okay, you can't play video games, Tremaine, all day, so you have to read. And I was like, okay, I'll read some of Granddad's books, and they were just things about World War Two, the Holocaust, and all sorts of things like that. So it's interesting to see how. So were you? So you always consumed So you enjoyed mythology, right?
Oh yes, yes.
See, I didn't enjoy mythology. I was always thinking, I'd rather learn about what the people did, which is
Hmm.
not good for a fiction writer.
People don't do much, I find. Well, they do, but it's over a long period of time.
Yeah,
In fiction, things are so much more condensed and exciting.
true. Yeah, actually, that's a
Now,
good point.
speaking of a long time ago, 1934 is when he was discharged due to the TB.
Right. Oh, so 1 year
Um,
after the rise of Hitler. Yep.
1934?
1933 is the year Hitler came to power.
Ah, so he left at a good time if he doesn't want to die. Um, although he had TB,
Yeah,
so
I was going to say the TV probably wasn't a gem either.
um, it was. So he was in hospital for quite a while with TB, just bedridden, and that's when he developed the waterbed. Well, designed the waterbed. He didn't make one, but he was like, this sucks so hard. And he'd heard of concepts of waterbeds, but they were just a rubber bladder filled with water that you slept on. His concept of the waterbed, it was just so much more advanced. It had stuff inside it for extra firmness, like it was made of cells. I don't know, you look up his waterbed, and it's very close to the modern waterbed, to the point where the person credited as the creator of the waterbed. So that's Mr. Hall? Yes, Charles Hall. He applied for a patent and was turned down because the patent office went, this is Heinlein's. You haven't changed it enough from Heinlein's. And he was like, but it's
real.
It's been 25 years since he did his one, and I'm actually gonna like make it. And they're like, make it unique, because this is just what Heinlein wrote and drew and made.
Could you imagine if that had happened with? Because we talked about this in one of the previous episodes about H.G. Wells designing the first thing. But like, oh, that would be so funny. Just, it's fascinating, isn't it, how these sci-fi authors can create things that hadn't even existed, and somehow the imagination's an amazing thing, Jake.
I suppose the thing with the tank is the military don't care about patents.
Good point. Yeah.
So it was during his pretty much when he married Ginny, his long-term wife.
Yeah.
Although 15 years wasn't too bad with Leslie McDonald. But the one he never got divorced from, the one he lived with for his life. That's
Right.
when he made a swing to the right in terms of politics.
Right, yeah.
Now, to be fair, a swing to the right for him, and this is according to Asimov, that's when he took a right turn on politics. After his swing to the right, he worked very strongly in Upton Sinclair's socialist movement, End Poverty in Canada. Sorry, California. End Poverty in California.
So he went from an anarchist to a socialist.
Basically, yeah. Or libertarian to socialist, perhaps.
Well, that's not a swing to the right, that's a swing... Oh, yeah, I see. Because, well, this is the problem with the political spectrum, isn't it? Because it's like, well, is libertarian right or is it left? Is it... It's kind of...
It depends on the
Yeah.
type, because there's subsets which can be on either side, sort of horseshoe theory. But yes, after his swing to the right, he...
In quotations, yeah.
Well, he ran for the Californian State of Assembly as a left-wing Democrat.
And he was a registered Republican, wasn't he, in his early life?
Sorry, it was his second. It was his second wife who was the registered Republican.
Oh, okay.
The extremely liberal, alcoholic, registered Republican. So he was doing okay. He had jobs here and there when his health allowed for it. He was a real estate agent. He was a silver miner. You know, you pick up odd jobs in the 30s. But
I mean, those were the days where you could, like, go to a new town, find a job, find a house, find a wife, all within the same week, yeah.
Yeah. So he had his disability pension from the Navy. So to answer the previous question, it would have been an honourable discharge.
Yeah.
Dishonourable, you lose all of that.
Yeah.
But he had a mortgage to pay off. So he decided to go for something a bit more lucrative. He started writing fiction.
If you want to know why I'm laughing, it's because in fiction writing you can spend 2 to 3 years writing a story, get to the end of it, and go, this is shit, and throw it out. And start all over again. And,
So, his first story, Lifeline, is part of his Future History series? It's not really a series. It's hard to describe. I guess you'd call it a series. They don't necessarily connect to each other, but they're conceptually similar. So he wrote Lifeline. He did write it for a contest. He just wanted to win a prize. But he ended up selling it to Astounding Science Fiction for a lot more than the prize was going to be. So, if he won first place, followed it with more future history novels, Misfit. People loved him. People in the industry loved him.
oh, okay.
They were like, 1 year after his first book, he was considered to be the leader of what's called social science fiction.
Right, and what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
So it's soft science fiction as opposed to hard science
Hard,
fiction,
yeah.
obviously. Doesn't go with the technology or space opera, but is more speculation about sociology and anthropology.
Right, okay, yeah.
So, 1984, right?
Yeah.
That is social science fiction, because it's not the TVs can watch you. It's, well, there's government and there's how people interact with each other.
And also there's also the fact that if you examine 1984, it's more about the control of language and thought than it is about Big Brother's watching you.
But it is also about those things. But yeah, so it's about the social aspect.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Which is interesting because Heinlein was also incredibly emphatic on scientific accuracy as far as science had gone to that point.
Right.
So he didn't quite invent hard science fiction as a concept, but he was definitely a pioneer.
Right, yeah.
So that's very interesting to go with the social science, which is largely quite soft science fiction. He also hosted a literary society, the Manana Literary Society. He took quite a leading role in things quite early. 2 years after his first story, he was guest of honor at the Worldcon in Denver. Worldcon being the World Science Fiction Convention.
Right.
So, I mean, that is a incredibly fast rise to
yes, it is. Fucking asshole. Yep. I'm gonna go get TB. I'll be right
back. So writing was doing good for him in the early 40s, but something came up, unfortunately.
What could that be, Jack?
So I've tried to make sure I pronounce this correctly. I'm going to read it directly. It's World War II?
Ah, never heard of it. Was it?
So he was kind of recruited. I mean, it seems like he had a choice, but it was one of those things where it's like, well, your choice is that they'll make you do something you don't want to if you don't do something that's okay. So he was invited to work for the Navy as an aeronautical engineer.
Okay, yeah.
But yes, if he hadn't taken them up on that offer of employment, they probably would have given him some shit work.
So,
and
just quickly, because I know you actually have a similar story. Not a similar story, sorry. A story about your grandfather in England who, during the war...
Oh, he was a draft dodger.
Yeah. Do you want to tell... I feel like you should tell that story, because it's actually quite interesting, and it's quite a good insight into how Jag plays video games. Carry on, Jake.
So, my grandfather, during World War II, came to the conclusion that he didn't want to die.
Yep.
So he took not a huge change in lifestyle, from my understanding. He became a traveling salesman. The main focus was not so much the salesman, although he sold stuff, he made enough money to live
Yeah.
out of his car. The main focus was the traveling. Every time the draft caught up with him and sent him his draft letter, he was in a different city.
And then towards the end of the war, what happened?
He managed to keep it up for quite some time until they finally caught up with him. Said, "Hey, yo, we've got you now. You have to be in the military." Put him through the basic testing. He did pretty good. They said, "Right, which field do you want to be in?" And he went, "Well, the army, you get shot. The Air Force, they get shot a lot. I'll do Navy." Put him through training. He was going to be an engineer. And shortly before he was due to finish, the war ended. So he had the majority of an engineering qualification, after which he went into the Merchant Navy and finished his engineering. He was an electrical engineer for the Merchant Navy. So, highly recommend.
Draft dodging.
Or find a civilian job, which is what Heinlein did.
Yeah. And so the reason I say that's like how Jag plays video games is Jag is very good at finding holes in video games.
I don't know what you're talking about, good sir.
No, flying seagulls that are dead definitely don't make it. Anyway. That didn't help you, to be fair. That infuriated you.
I often find ways to break video games. I'd be great QA, but the actual job of QA sounds terrible.
What, sitting at a computer just continuously trying to do something, and it's like, oh. Anyway,
unfortunately, QA involves hitting the same thing again and again, as opposed to exploring and seeing what you can find.
right.
It's a lot more focused. It kind of sucks. So I say it was a civilian job. It was at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard.
Okay, yeah.
Aeronautical engineer at the Navy Aircraft Materials Center.
Right.
Now, he was quite respected. He managed to recruit two names that you may be familiar with.
Oh, yes.
Isaac Asimov,
Oh.
who we'll do a bio on as well.
Is he famous?
He wrote some books. He invented the modern concept of the robot. I say modern concept because there are essentially ancient concepts as well, and
Golems, for
even
example,
the
yeah.
mechanical version. There's the mechanical Turk, which predates Isaac Asimov, and also L. Sprague du Camp.
Oh, I haven't heard of him.
I don't know if it's supposed to be pronounced French. He was American,
Oh.
born in New York. But he's also a science fiction writer.
Oh, what name did he go by?
What name did he go by?
Yeah.
Leon Sprague de Camp?
Oh, I thought it was... Okay, never mind. Go!
He wrote under his own name, yes. He de Camp is the person who came up with the term extraterrestrial.
Okay. Yeah, that's...
And also the shortening ET.
Oh. Well...
His actual works aren't that well known compared to some of the other authors we talk about.
Yeah.
He did a lot of time travel, a lot of alternate history. But no, it is fair if you've not heard of the Isolingual or Gavigan's Bar.
No.
Yeah, no, fair enough. As I said, he's not hugely known.
To be honest, alternate history always pisses me off, so it's probably not worth the...
It's strange that he's not better known because, for example, his story, The Tritonian Ring, was
Right.
published as a two-piece book, along with H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. They were published together as a double feature.
See, part of the reason
Yeah,
I don't like alternate history is because
you like history.
no. For some reason, when I look at alternate history videos, they always seem to be very, what do you call it? Either really like America or really Nazi driven. Like, what if the Nazis won World War II? What if the mouse tank was developed? I'm like, okay.
Maybe you would like Els Sprague-de-Camp's
Oh yeah.
work then, because his historical fiction was a 5-novel series covering from the First Persian Empire to
Oh.
the waning of the Hellenistic period.
Oh, okay. So proper alternate history, like proper. So far back, you probably wouldn't know the difference.
And his focus was not on military; it was on scientific advancement.
Right. Oh, so
Uh,
sort of like like steampunk. Like, what if we hadn't developed oil or something like that? You mean like that? Like,
Not really.
not like that? No.
Um, it's more following the adventures of people who he's made up.
Right.
Kind of like if you wrote a fictional biography of um who's the guy who loved circles? You have disturbed my circles, and then they killed him. Ah, he invented the death ray
Oh,
in ancient Greece.
Nikola Tesla.
No, the guy who actually invented a death ray using mirrors in ancient Greece.
Oh,
Not Pythagoras.
Pythagoras had something to do with triangles. I think he was the one that
Yes, yes.
Pythagoras' theorem.
Anyway, his stories follow explorers, philosophers, um, never actual leaders. He just does interesting stuff. Well, more interesting, more personal stories, which is
Right.
great.
Yeah.
But so Heinlein recruited both of them to work with him.
Yeah.
Where they invented, among other things, a way to detect approaching kamikaze attacks. Basically, a great big reflector dish that you'd point in the. Well, you couldn't really point, it was stable, it was a set thing. But it would be pointing towards the direction Japanese planes would come from. And then you stood in the focal point. And can you hear a plane? No? It's good. Although later, yeah, they did put like microphones there and recorders instead.
Well, instead of some guy just standing there like, I think I hear a plane.
Tom Scott does an interesting video on somewhere in England, might be like Guernsey, where there's this giant concrete reflector to detect
Oh,
incoming
yes.
German, you know, the Blitz, just to give them some warning. Very
Quickly,
effective.
women and children, get into the get into the bunkers.
In the hole. Yeah. So he decided to write non-fiction at the onset of the Cold War.
Right.
Because he was like, I think politics is now interesting.
Yeah.
And it pays more. Yeah. Money still mattered. So that's why he wrote The Green Hills of Earth. Which makes him the first science fiction author to get out of what is known as the, quote, pulp ghetto.
Oh, you mean like the Pulp Magazines,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, The Green Hills of Earth was a science
Do you want to
fiction
explain what
story.
the Pulp Magazines are?
So the Pulp Magazines is very cheap wood pulp paper it was basically, if you're familiar with yellow journalism or the Penny Dreadfuls or dime novels, basically it's how cheap can we get out this material. It was the late 1800s version of
Wattpad.
clickbait as well.
Oh,
It was, let's put something on here that people will go, oh, they wouldn't do that, would they? So quite often it was highly sexual. Quite often, I mean, it was clickbait. So they'd have like a black man whipping a white man on the cover, and it's like, what is this?
I beg your fuck.
So they'd do anything to get you to read it. Now, some of the covers were amazing because they just do these like ergotamine poisoning fever dream covers. Have you go, who is this buxom woman without a top who appears to be coming out of a mirror? You know, pure madness.
What happens when legal cocaine is going on and legal heroin?
And it is interesting because it got these really bizarre, really madness stories out there. So science fiction was seen as very lowbrow, but so was who did Oliver Twist?
Oh, Charles Dickens.
Charles Dickens was considered trash. He wrote for Pulp Magazines.
Well, he will. Yeah.
So was Sweeney Todd. Sherlock was quite often in these. It was rubbish.
Yeah, and this relates to one of our earliest episodes where I said a comment Bill Maher had made about Shakespeare and Dickens, and it's actually not true.
Shakespeare was just dirty jokes.
Shakespeare, if you actually read how it was received at the time, it was for the peasants. It was for the lowbrow of society. And if you read about what Dickens was, essentially, it was like Harry Potter, really. Like it was,
except released a chapter at a time in a book known in a series of Pulp Magazines known for being soft porn and horror, basically.
Right, and I think also Stephen King got his start doing that as well. He wrote for...
It was essentially Playboy.
Yeah.
Quite often.
And
but just articles.
And obviously people were thinking, well, no, Playboy's just porn. It wasn't at the time. It used to also have, like, articles on, like, politics and things like that. It also had short stories that were not always pornographic. They were sometimes just horror, or they were just science fiction. Yeah, there were lots of the pulp magazines, and that used to make a lot of money, but they also used to produce some of the great fictions of their era. There's a lot of
Chuck Palahniuk wrote for Playboy.
Yeah. So if you consider, because people think, okay, this writer here who's writing, well, take Ayn Rand. We talked about her yesterday, just privately. She wrote some very lengthy novels in a very intellectual way. She's not really famous anymore. Well, except with 14-year-old boys. But if you look at what she was writing at the time, that would have been seen as quite intellectual. That would have been seen as something, oh, this will last throughout the ages. It didn't. It'll be dust by the time we get 100 years in the future. Because a lot of people who write just to impress people, they just disappear. Whereas things like Charles Dickens, Shakespeare, the Iliad, all these people who wrote stories that were just there to entertain people, they stay because they have much more interesting concepts, much more interesting storylines.
if we can touch on Shakespeare a little bit,
Yeah.
in its original pronunciation, most of it rhymed.
Yeah.
A lot of it rhymed, and we don't realize because we don't have the same slang anymore. We don't see
Yeah.
a lot of the jokes. If you're familiar with Much Ado About Nothing,
Yeah. Yeah.
nothing was slang for the JJ. So the title was a pun. It was, man, these people are getting all really worked up about pussy, aren't they? Which is not how people view Shakespeare if
It's
you've only
just
done
a
a
trash.
little bit in school.
Yeah, so and that's what that's important. But anyway, Jay, we should probably get back to Heinlein before we run out of time.
And also, people give Romeo and Juliet a lot of grief because, 13-year-olds fell in love after only 3 weeks? That's ridiculous. To be fair, Hamlet went from no murder to very much willing to murder over the course of an afternoon.
All because he saw a ghost, yeah.
But yeah, so the fun thing with pulp magazines is
They were fun.
because they were trashy, you were allowed to write anything, so they were experimental. And a lot of the classics of today were first published in pulp magazines. We're talking Lovecraft, Agatha Christie, Ray Bradbury, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and William S. Burroughs. Like, F. Scott Fitzgerald,
Oh,
Rudyard Kipling. You know, these are like powerhouses, right?
yeah.
They wrote in these trash magazines because that's where you could. So, they found out how to detect planes. Cool. He became a serious writer. He wrote a lot of juvenile works, specifically for the magazine Boy's Life.
Right.
He wrote Starship Troopers. Everyone knows Starship Troopers.
With the giant
There's
bugs.
varying opinions. Well, it was originally called Starship Soldiers. I prefer Starship Troopers. I feel like Troopers has, like, not quite implications, but it brings things to mind which better suits. But his main thing was, much like how ABBA didn't want to keep doing songs in the same style. You know, people asked ABBA, when are you doing another, version of this? And they're like, no, we've done that one. If you want that one, listen to it. We're doing a new song. Heinlein was the same for books. He didn't do many serials.
Right.
Asimov did all the robots. He did Foundation and Empire. It was a very following on from stuff. Whereas Heinlein was like, no, I've done a book about that. Now I'm doing Stranger in a Strange Land. Now I'm doing The Moon as a Harsh Mistress.
And we can see that in sort of, I guess you could say, I always bring back to Star Wars because that's all I know. We see that in Star Wars as George Lucas didn't want to make the same movies over and over again. So we saw in the original trilogy, each time there was a new movie, there were new ships, new concepts, there were new force powers, there were all sorts of new things. And it wasn't, but some of the story still followed the same sort of thing, like, dark side, light side fight and things like that. But
we've spoken on Lucas. He was an ideas man.
Yeah.
He needed an execution man helping him.
Yeah, which he tried to get, but none of his director friends wanted to do it in the prequel
as we
trilogy.
said, his wife at the time helped.
Yeah. Worst breakup in movie history.
Thankfully, Heinlein was also managed to be an execution man, as well as
Yeah.
We touched on this. Jerry Pournelle chaired, but he was a member of the Citizens Advisory Council on National Space Policy. Later, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So he and fellow science fiction writer Larry Niven, helped write space policy papers for the Reagan administration. Now, there were other members like Buzz Aldrin, General Daniel O'Graham, aerospace engineer Max Hunter, the vice president for North American Rockwell, George Merrick. But they also had science fiction writers because they wanted to understand potential ramifications of some of their decisions in a social matter. Because, again, Heinlein was very much a social science fiction author, so it was, well, if you do the rod from God idea, where you can just slam a ton of tungsten down on any location on the world, what's it going to do to the people? That makes any light in the sky terrifying.
Right.
So is that
sort
one
of
a
like
star,
drones.
or is that one a gun?
Yeah. Sort of like how drones nowadays in like Middle Eastern countries have made the sky terrifying. Yeah, made the sky terrifying. It's
And
sort
my
of the
understanding is he
ramification.
wanted to avoid that. He wanted space to be an exciting realm of potential, not.
Yeah.
Now, I did mention his perversions. So I will touch on things that may be considered perversions. He and his second wife had an open relationship, which was definitely unusual for the 1930s.
Yep.
He was very much so in favor of free love. He was, as a quite radical. He was a nudist. That is something that is expressed in a number of his books, including Friday. Friday's an interesting one for me and you, Tremaine, because a lot of it takes place in New Zealand.
Really?
Yeah, a socialist semi-utopia of pluralistic marriages and open nudism. A lot of science fiction authors, for some reason, pick New Zealand to be a left-wing paradise.
Well,
loved New Zealand.
We'll find out in 2023 if we stay that way. But yeah, things aren't looking that good right now. But yeah, okay.
He wrote a book called Fandom's Freehold, which is about. So it focuses a lot on bomb shelters during the Cold War.
Right.
But it was a very interesting attempt. So again, this was the 1930s. Fully published in 1964. Okay, so 1964. Yeah. So he was trying to understand why being bad to women and being bad to, I'm going to use the term of the time, blacks, was bad. He knew it was bad, but he was like, how do I express that? How do I get my point across? And how do I make people understand? And how do I understand it myself?
Right.
He did it really badly.
Okay.
So badly.
How
So
bad?
for the short synopsis is some survivalists, some preppers, a family of preppers who have a bomb shelter, which he did. He had a bomb shelter under his house.
Right.
Like, oh, the bombs are coming. They go into their shelter. The bombs somehow throw them through time into the future, where the blacks rule over the whites. And
right.
similar to, there was a story in Playboy where homosexuality was the norm and straight people are looked down upon and harassed as a minority, which worked really well. And people wrote into Playboy and said it was disgusting, and Hefner personally responded saying, we just switched gay and straight. If you don't like this, you shouldn't like how gays are treated now.
You know, like
Heinlein kind of fucked it up
yeah,
because his noble people of African ancestry who have white slaves, they also are terrible cannibals. Um,
right,
it's it kind of ended up like it was supposed to be about how anti-minority and how anti-women views are bad, but it relied on stereotypes that portray women and minorities in a bad light, like
right.
blacks are cannibals
So there
and
would be a lack of
women are good
exposure,
for
right?
babies. Um, he knew, like, I want to give him as much credit as possible. He knew that these were bad things, but he couldn't get to an outside view on it. He was trying to do it from within us. He was still so heavily influenced by the society which held those views that he couldn't get away from those views to criticize them. He had to display those views and criticize them.
Right.
So it just didn't work. You know, it just didn't work.
Yeah.
Um, I think before we end up this episode, the biggest thing I mentioned last time was about cross-generational relationships. He did write a lot about young teens, like 13-year-olds, hooking up and getting together with people in their 40s, I think, in one of the books. It was pretty standard. But I will say, yeah, I phrased it as he wanted to, get with his grandkids. He didn't have grandkids.
Uh,
This wasn't an explicit desire of his that he was expressing. It was that thing where he takes a concept that we identify as bad, change up the rules a little. For example, in one of his books, he has uh, a boy and girl twin pairing. If you're familiar with genetics, you get half your genes from your father, half from your mother. The boy and girl inherited from their parents the exactly opposite genes. So they have no consanguination. They are genetically not related to
right.
each other. And so the question was, having taken away the genetic concerns,
What
is it
are the
okay for them to have
ramifications?
kids?
Yeah.
Does it matter? They're the same age, there's no power dynamic there. There's no genetic concern, which is the main thing we point to as a problem for incest.
Yeah.
Is it okay or not? And then he does leave it to you to decide.
Which is often a way to make yourself look like a pervert because people project their perversions onto you.
Yeah, you raise questions like, is this okay? He does have characters who are intersex. We mentioned this
Mm,
in a way earlier podcast. And because of the time, this was seen as perversion. And
right.
because of how it was taken contemporarily, we still kind of see it that way. It's the anchoring bias. Um, if you go into it with no, preconception, all you zombies is fine. That's the one with the intersex individual.
Right.
Like, it's not a problem. And when it comes to the cross-generational relationships, there is often a sort of twist to it, which makes it a different situation. In one of the stories, someone meets someone who is, I think, like 8, but then basically gets frozen in he time travels and basically meets that same person again when they're like 20. And it's
Right.
like, well, his conception of the person is from them when they were a child. How creepy is it to get with them as an adult when for him no time has passed, but the person is now an adult? So
Right.
it's
So sort
about
of like,
how, the question is the person's conception of the person as a child, does that make it inappropriate? And it also raises the question of the flip side, like, if you see someone as an adult when they're not, does that make it better or worse? And these are questions you can explore, but if you try to do so, you definitely look like a Christian.
yeah.
But also, like, when we look at history, it's like, I mean, I mentioned Romeo and Juliet. They were supposed to be, I think, 13 and 15.
Yeah.
We look at that and we go, oh, that's too young. That's horrifying, And the 15-year-old is a monster. At the time, it's like he wrote about them at that age because it's like that's when people fall in love, and they're young enough that they're still stupid and hormonal.
Right. Yeah.
So, in the future, are we going to be like anything younger than 21 is disgusting? Are we looking at people now who will be considered children and viewing them as adults?
Well, we already see that sort of in cross cultures, and like for in Europe, for example, and in New Zealand, the age of consent is 16, and like in
Yeah, we view
America,
them as adults. Do Americans view us as disgusting for being
yeah,
into
and
children?
they often do because when we say that, they say oh, and it's like, well,
We
that's
think they're
yeah,
adults. We don't let them drink.
we don't let them drink or join the army, but but to be fair, you can join the army and star in a porno, but you can't drink afterwards
That's
in
right.
America.
Kill a man for the government, but you can't have a beer after it. So yeah, he raises issues of like age for relationships and other things. I think child drinking is in a couple of them.
yeah.
And other drugs. But it's a valid question. It's just sometimes he takes it to an extreme where everyone goes, well, yeah, 12-year-old's a kid.
Everyone just goes, ooh.
Everyone agrees that's bad. We don't need to talk about that. Well, maybe we should. And still agree that it's bad.
Yeah.
There's no harm in considering it. Eh,
Anyway,
as a hypothetical.
so I think that's a wrap on Heinlein. If you've enjoyed this episode, for God knows
You're a
what
pervert.
yeah, you're a pervert. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to follow us on Facebook and Instagram because we post regular content there to remind you that we've posted on Tuesday at 7 AM NZST. And also,
I will say we are considering doing similar biographies for Arthur C. Clarke, for Isaac Asimov,
George
for
Lucas.
Frank Herbert, and his son, Brian Herbert.
Okay.
Because they work together on some Dune books, and he's also an author by his own right. George Lucas. If there
Dan
is an
Simmons.
author or creator
Yeah.
that you want us to do a similar story on, let us know, and if it's someone that we're familiar with.
Well, even if not, because Jag's very good at finding creepy facts about people, so we'll definitely consider it. So please go check out those pages, and if you want to see someone, go ahead and comment. Thank you for listening. I've been Tremaine. This has been Jag. Goodbye.